I work for the Canada Organic Trade Association, and for the past few years, we've been contracted by POGI and working closely with POGI to bring this organic agriculture in the Prairies report that I'm hoping folks have had a chance to look at. So this is the third year that I've been working on the report, and if you've been on the call before, you might have heard me talk about it. So this year I'm going to just give an overview for anyone who hasn't heard about it before, and then pick out some of the key pieces of what we found this year. So some of the trends over time and some of the wins in the different provinces. So just to give a bit of a background on the report, it uses data that CODA collects from certification bodies, organic certification bodies for Canadian operations in Canada. So most of these certification bodies are Canadian, and then there's some that are abroad that certify Canadian companies. So they voluntarily supply the data, and so it's not standardized in how it's provided to us, nor in the categories that they have within their data sets in terms of types of operators or acreage categories. So that's something that we've been working on improving over time. And it is difficult, but we're trying to work closely with POGI to make sure that it's accurate, and then doing checks with some of our contacts at Stats Canada and AAFC Agriculture Canada to try and make sure it gets better. So a few notes on that. The past couple of years, we've made sure that the report is only including certified operators because the information around transitional operators or acreage is not complete. There's no requirement to track that data until the third year of transition, I believe. So we've left that out so that we're not misleading when we release any data on it, knowing that we're missing a whole chunk of transitional operations that aren't being tracked. When I go through the report, we talk about operations as the overall term of any company that is certified to the Canadian standards. And we break it down by crop producers, which includes field crop producers, vegetable producers, livestock, etc. Or sorry, not livestock. So producers, crop producers, then we have livestock producers and processors. So processors include handlers, manufacturers, processors, what else? Millers, seed cleaners, abattoirs, etc. So that's just an idea of those different categories. And just a reminder, when we look at data in the report, when we look at total operations, this includes all of the operations within those other categories, but it's not necessarily a sum of them. So for example, one operation may be both a crop producer and a livestock producer, so you can't add the crop producer totals and the livestock producer totals and the processor totals to equal total operations, because lots of operations fall into multiple categories. And one final note on the type of data that we're working with and how we analyze it. Because we are trying to improve this process each year, that means that we've been revising some of the categories, and it sometimes means that when we see issues over time with certain pieces of data, we'll go back and resolve them. So if you're looking at last year's report that we released and trying to compare it to this year, there is a chance that it will not align because we've revised some of the numbers. So this is common practice. So just a note on that. And also new to this report is that we've started to round the numbers. So for acreage, we round to the closest 100, and for operations, we round to the closest 5. This is to signal to anyone reading that the data is best estimates. So we do the best with what we've got, but we know that there are issues with the data, so we don't want anyone to read it and say, oh, there's exactly 843 operations in said province. We want them to know that it's, the best estimate. So that's why we use rounding. And for that reason also, you'll notice in some of the charts when you're looking through that some of the subtotals will not equal the total. That's because it's rounded. So you might see, I think it was pointed out the other day, one table that says a subcategory with 200 and another with 300, and the total is 400. That's because it's rounded. We don't add the two rounded subtotals. We round the actual total. So I'd be happy to go more in depth with that later if anyone has any questions about that. So I'm going to go through the report. So if folks have it, you can follow along. So I'm going to start on page 5. We're looking at putting the prairies in context. So where do the prairies stand when we compare the data that we have to national statistics? So figure 1, we have 3 tree maps there that show the distribution of organic operations, crop producers, and acreage nationally. So this is just supposed to give a quick visual idea of, okay, when we're looking at total operations, how many of them are in the prairies. So you can see in that the top left box there for total operations, we have Saskatchewan is the dark green, and it's showing that there are 16% of Canada's certified organic operations are in Saskatchewan. Then we have 10% in Alberta and 3% in Manitoba. And then it's an easy comparison to look over to the other provinces, Quebec at 33%, Ontario at 21%, BC 14%, and Atlantic at 3%. So similarly, you can see crop producers that have a similar distribution between the prairies and the non-prairie provinces. Whereas when we compare that to acreage, which is down below, you can see that the prairies take up a much greater portion of Canada's acreage. So Saskatchewan is at 37%, Alberta at 17%, and Manitoba at 4%. So cumulatively, the prairies account for 58% of Canada's organic acres. And then for the other two charts, operations, cumulatively, the prairies are 29% of organic operations and 33% of organic crop producers. And as I mentioned, crop producers includes field crops, grains, fruits, vegetables, etc. And we don't have a tree map for it, but just another point is that when we look at processors, the prairies only have 14% of certified processors and then 17% of organic livestock operations. So I'm going to move on to the next page, page 6. Looking at figure 2 is another way to visualize this relationship between the prairie provinces, their crop producers, and acreage. So to give you an idea of what this chart is showing, on the vertical axis, the y-axis shows crop producer numbers. So you'll see that, if we're looking at the vertical positioning of provinces, that those up higher have more crop producers, lower have fewer. So if you look, the x-axis is the year. So over time, we can see in 2017, for this to the right, it's clear that Quebec has the most crop producers. And at the bottom, you can see Manitoba and the Atlantic provinces have much fewer. And the bubble size is to show acreage amounts. So it's to show that relationship. So although Quebec has the most crop producers, it is visually, you can see that the acreage is much smaller than Saskatchewan, which is the dark green there, which has about the same number of crop producers as Ontario, but much more acreage. Okay, so let's just flip my page here. So I'm going to go into a bit in the operations side of things first to show some growth over time in the different categories that we track. So figure 3 shows you the last 4 years of data for the prairie totals. So we can see there that crop producers has been on a steady incline. Livestock operations has been more or less stable. You'll notice there the numbers for livestock operations. We have 130, 120, 130, 125. Remember that because of the rounding, that may show a greater variance in actual changes, because if say for 2014 there were 127 livestock operations, and then in 2015 there were 122, the rounding would make them seem like a larger change between those 2 years. So just keep that in mind. Then processors has had a bit of a jump in between 2016 and 2017, reaching 265. You'll notice that 2015 is left out of processors because we identified that year as an error in the data, so we removed it. And then overall total operations has reached 1,840 in the Prairies. Moving on to operations, we have from 2014 to 2017. As I mentioned, it's been steadily growing. A lot of this growth in operations has been from growth in Alberta. So where do I have it here? So in operations, Alberta has had 240 operations added since 2014. So that was a big jump there. And the percentage, you'll see the orange line if you're looking at the charts, the percentage of organic operations in the Prairies has remained stable around 30%, and then just at 29% for 2017. So it's not changing too much. Looking at crop producers, we have data back until 2009, which is great. Some of those newer categories we only started tracking more recently. So you can see the trend there that 2009, we essentially just surpassed that peak. So in 2009, after that, there was a steady decline in organic crop producers in the Prairies, and then it's rebounded now. As I mentioned, a lot of that growth is due to growth in Alberta in particular. So Alberta, out of the three provinces, is the only one that has surpassed its 2009 previous peak. So going from 320 in 2009 to 525. The other provinces, Saskatchewan and Manitoba, are very close, but they haven't reached those numbers yet. So processors in the Prairies, so it's been growing. We're at 265 in 2017. It's more evenly distributed between the different provinces. So when we look at crop producers, there's a lot more concentrated in Saskatchewan, whereas for processors, there are more in Saskatchewan than the other two provinces, but it's more evenly distributed. And the percentage of processors in the Prairies has declined since 2009, but has remained around 14% since 2014. And lastly, organic livestock operations. So it's been fairly stable in previous years, though the percentage of the Canadian total has declined slightly in the last year to 17%. Part of this is because other areas like Quebec and Ontario are having growth in livestock operations, whereas indications are that there's underdeveloped supply chains, particularly for beef, that is limiting farmers from transitioning to organic beef production in particular. All right, I'm going to move on to Acreage Stat. So for our 2017 data, we reached an estimated 1.8 million acres in the Prairies. So that was an addition of 250,000 acres across the three provinces from 2016. So that was pretty demonstrable growth that we can see there when we look at Figure 8. Acreage was growing. There was a little bit of fluctuation there, and then the last 3 years have had quite significant growth since 2015. And we see that the percentage of organic acreage in the Prairies has been declining since 2009, but it's sort of peaked around 60%. So since 2014, it's been 60%, 58%, 56%, and then back to 58%. And if we look at the distribution of organic acreage within the Prairies, we have 64% is in Saskatchewan, so almost 2/3, 30% Alberta, and 6% in Manitoba. And overall, 58% of Canadian, or I already mentioned that, I guess, 58% of Canadian agriculture, or organic agricultural lands are in the Prairies. So not unsurprisingly, if we look at the breakdown in acreage types in the prairies, the largest category is what we call pasture, forage, and natural areas, which is a fairly large category that also includes perennial and annual forages, permanent pasture, fallow land, green manures, wild collection, and natural areas. So that accounts for 54% of the prairie's acreage. And then that's followed by field crops, which is at 46%. And then we have fruits and vegetables. And the final category we have is uncategorized. This is a category that we have to use based on the way that some of the data is supplied to us when we have an acreage allotment that is described as having both forage, tomatoes, some cereals, et cetera, It has too many categories in it that we can't slot it into any of the other categories that we have, that we are able to separate out. But luckily for the prairie data, at least, it's a fairly small portion, so it's not too big of an issue in distorting the figures. So in looking at the growth of acreage, in Table 2, we have some of the breakdown from 2015 to 2017 in acreage amounts in the prairies. So some of the biggest growth was in other field crop categories, which includes hemp. So that category had a growth of 318%, which was largely driven by hemp acreage, which according to our data in 2015 was around 5,000 and grew to over 18,000. And we have 79% of the organic hemp acreage in our data is in the prairies itself. And then another notable category would be pulses, which we've seen a 59%. We've seen 59% growth between 2015 and 2017. So these growth numbers I'm mentioning aren't year-over-year growth, they're absolute growth, just an FYI. And I'll quickly touch on a couple of the categories that we pulled out. So field crops being a very important category in the prairies and one that we have fairly detailed data for. We're not able to report on any of the subcategories of pasture, forage, natural areas, and that whole category, just because the data is fairly, it's not particularly robust when we break it out, so we leave it in the larger category. But with field crops we can, which is great. So looking at the cereals section, we can see that the top cereals in the prairies are wheat and oats. So 89% of Canada's organic wheat is in the prairies, and 91% of Canadian organic oats are in the prairies. And if we take cereals together as a category, we're at 574,000 in the prairies, which a good chunk of that, 379,000 coming from Saskatchewan. So overall cereals, 88% of Canadian organic cereal acreage is in the prairies. Pulses. So pulses, as I mentioned, have grown by 59% since 2015, and 93% of pulse acreage in Canada is in the prairies, so that's pretty huge. And this is mostly lentils, which are primarily in Saskatchewan, and then dried peas, which are split. There's more in Alberta, 56,000 and 33,000 in Saskatchewan, and a little bit in Manitoba. And I'll just I'm not going to go through each of the charts. I'm skimming over some of them, so I encourage people to read them after to check out some of the yearly growth in each of those categories as well. And oil seeds, we have flax and mustard are the important ones in the prairies. So we have 99% of organic flax in the prairies and 95% of mustard in the prairies. And these are predominantly in Saskatchewan. And then overall, 65% of oilseed acreage is, organic oilseed acreage is in the prairies. And then finally, I'm just going to touch a little bit on some high-level trends that we've seen in each of the provinces. So at the end of the report, there's 2 pages dedicated to each prairie province, which pulls out their specific data. So in Alberta, it's clear that there's been a lot of growth. So as I mentioned, 240 new operations between 2014 and 2017, a 28% increase in acreage, which meant 118,000 additional acres. And pulses are a big category and has had very significant growth in the last few years. We've recorded 249% growth 2015 to 2017. And peas in particular in that category has been very important. Saskatchewan, we also have seen growth as well, 90 new operations 2014 to 2017. This has been the greatest percent increase in acreage, so 30% increase, and because it's a large land base to begin with, this was 270,000 additional acres between 2015 and 2017. And lastly, Manitoba similarly has seen growth in operations, so smaller amounts, so around 40 operations since 2014. Acreage, similar growth as the other two provinces at 29%, so 116,000 new acres. And Manitoba showed the largest increase in processors from 50 to 70. So that's the largest across the three provinces. Great. All right, so I think that's all I'm going to go into right now, and I welcome any questions people have about some of the data that we're seeing, any questions about methodology or any of our future reports.
Okay, thank you, Jill. And I will just open the floor to questions or comments.
This is Sam at Gray Millers. I'm not real sure on how you're getting the data, but I mean, based off of the numbers that you've seen and historically getting agricultural acreage base, I mean, how accurate do you feel like these acres are as a whole? I mean, they do, in my head thinking about it, I don't think we're far off at all, but I don't know, that's kind of a very broad question. And, I mean, you could throw a number at it, and I probably am going to agree.
Right. No, it's an important question, too, because we want to be careful with not being misleading when we put out this acreage, and that's why we're trying to take more steps to be transparent about how it's, these are best estimates. We don't have so I think something that I found very helpful in the last couple of years that I've been leading on this report has been working more closely with the POGI partners and bringing on some consultants that are that know more about the context, because I don't live in the prairies myself. So to know, for example, if you see a certain amount of, I think pea acreage a few years ago was a problem that I wouldn't have known about because I just see the data, but the people that are on the ground, they're like, there's no way we could have that. I know the people who work there, but those types of pieces of information that are really important to fact-checking what we have. So I think that we're improving that process. It's not perfect by any means. So we have contextual knowledge that can add to it, but we don't really have a good other data set to compare it with. The government doesn't track this. We can probably go to we could go to some of the bigger players and ask them about some of their information, but based on resources and confidentiality and that kind of stuff, we haven't gone down that route at this moment. So there are things that we can look into to improve it, but it's challenging. So I think that taking this as a best estimate and working with it as we move forward to improve it is where we're at right now.
Yeah, and I'd like to add a couple of thoughts to that too. I think from my perspective, this is Marla, it's been really helpful to have the same person at CODA for 3 years. So Jill, I completely understand what you're saying about not having the on the ground sort of knowledge or expertise, but to be building your knowledge base over time, I think is really valuable to the sector. So you can also, provide a bit of a check and balance or whatever on what you're seeing. And then also with the data, whenever I talk about it with, the long list of provisos or things you need to take into consideration, I always use it as an opportunity to advocate for better data for the sector. So I also think, when I'm speaking with, federal or provincial government folks, just to really kind of talk about how, this is a limiting factor to the growth and the development of the sector. So kind of trying to take or finding the silver lining in it as well. Are there any other questions, comments?
Sorry, I had one more. This is Sam with Green Millers. When we looked at total acreage, it showed as our organic acreage went up, as a percentage, it was going down. Am I thinking about that correctly? I'll try and get to the page here, or the chart. And why do you think that is?
I'm thinking, are you talking about figure 8, where prairie acreage is going up, but the national percentage is going down?
Yeah, figure 8. There you go, yep.
Yeah. So that would mean that essentially the prairies are growing, which is great, but other regions as a whole are growing faster. So the percentage of the land allotment that's in the prairies, it can still be growing while other places have more, so then the percentage of the Canadian total is decreasing. Does that make sense?
So, that's just like taking forest land or land that's not agricultural and putting it into agricultural land, essentially, right?
Well, any other, I wonder if I have my other sheet here of national acreage, but I don't have it back to, we don't have it back as far as the one that I have for the prairies. But yeah, any other provinces, so I would guess it's probably driven by BC and maybe a bit Quebec, that their organic acreage has improved or increased quite rapidly in recent years, so it's taking away some of that dominance that the prairies had for particularly Saskatchewan, for having the most acreage.
And I guess my follow-on question then, Jill, is are we kind of comparing apples and apples, or it's just kind of like all land, so it might not be, the prairies is likely continuing to kind of dominate in that field crop area, but other areas in the country may be building in, whatever it is, livestock or horticulture or, other organic production, right?
Yeah, I can probably, I don't remember which one is field crops. Yeah, we have 82, or the prairies have 82% of field crop acreage, so that's still pretty huge. So it's probably other areas, perhaps the pasture, forage, and natural areas, that proportion of the Canadian total might be dropping slightly.
Right. All right. Any other questions?
Hi, Jill. Cody here at ProCert.
Hi, Cody.
Driving right now, but so I don't have your presentation up in front of me. But do you break down the processing numbers on, are they in the prairies, to separate the seed cleaning or the package and labeling certificates for the processors?
No, we don't have that level of detail. Like from some certification bodies, we'll get more specific information, but some of them we only get, like, they'll identify themselves whether an operation is a crop producer and or processor and or livestock operation. So we don't have any more detail there, unfortunately.
any other questions or comments? All right. Well, then I would just like to thank you, Jill, for sharing your knowledge on this very important subject for the sector.